Yo-ho, yo-ho, a pirate's life for me. In the dark summer heat of August 1695, and as the Red Sea splashed like blood at the ribs of the Fancy, Henry Avery's 46-gun frigate, the pirates crept through the Mandab Strait like an ill omen. The Fancy was a groaning mass of spite and devil warfare. Her sails were blood-stained by countless nights of reflected, crimson sunsets. The men aboard her spoke of her cursed nature, timbers of unshakable strength, her cannon like dragons that breathed souls in and fire out. There were tales and secret songs of the pact that Captain Jack Avery had made with sea itself before setting sail from Madagascar. Myths and fables of a solemn oath sealed with gunpowder and blood. No crown, no priest, no god, and no empire would ever again lay claim to his still beating heart. Some called him the arch-pirate, others the king of the pirates, and still others the bridge man. Aye, falling into his path could be a crossing to a new life of wealth and violent gambles, or to the locker itself where the souls cry from the deep. He was a cruel man, and the Fancy was a hellscape to behold. Battle-hardened and marked by the scars of raids and conquests, swabbed with the tears of widows and the insides of dead men. The Fancy never faltered. She cut not only through the sea, but the very stars and the planets themselves. Some swore her luck was endless. A fleet gathered, 6 captains, and each sworn to a share of the plunder that would spill from the Mughal treasure convoy onto their decks very shortly. Avery was a giant among them, his reputation for tactics and brutality preceding him wherever he went. As the others spoke of honor among thieves, of alliances of freedom from crowns, Avery looked down with tired eyes. Tired not of the life he lived or the lack of sleep, but from the language of men who did not understand destiny. They did not understand that fate must be seized from both friend and foe alike. There simply was not enough of it on this whole planet for every man. Yet he spoke as a leader that would guarantee a crossing to a different life. And perhaps that's why they called him the Bridge Man. The Empire would wish the winds to do the bidding of the king. He does not know that I have made her a spy for our cause. The wind is at our back, and our good thanks will come in the form of sovereigns and crowns dipped in blood, in treasure enough to buy empires and silence priests. This is her price. His men were silent as he spoke. He spoke as Leviathan, but also as a man. He was a leader of magnificent caliber. The cloth from which he was cut required no ordinary steel, but a temper of unknown substance and meaning. Looking upon the horizon, a gradient of the most magnificent red, pink, orange, and yellow hues, he drew closer to a young sailor. A soul committed to the treasonous acts of piracy and dedicated to the death of countryman and foreigner alike in pursuit of a life of fancy and quest. He took the lad by the hand, as a father would a son, and somehow knew that this lad would not survive the day. His dark eyes pierced the very soul of the beholder, and he asked loud enough to be heard by all, "Will you go with me?" Taken aback, the lad placed his other hand atop the one that held his left now. "Aye, sir, but I do not know your design." Avery smiled in a clever, understanding way that the seasoned ones recognized. It was a grin that would beckon confidence and trust to come quickly. "There are but few that know it," says I. The gaze of the pirate king again strayed to his darling love, the place where the sea met the sky. Her treasured embrace called him every waking moment of this life of danger and intrigue, and yet it required brief moments of close contact of a violent type that could not be avoided. Said the fellow in his grasp, "Tell me who do know it, that if you will not tell me yourself, I may ask them that can tell me." "Lad," the captain spoke without changing the target of his piercing, yet adoring scrutiny. "We should all know by the hour of falling darkness, of trembling twilight, and of barely grasping day." The men bent their ears, the ones in the back trying to draw closer to listen to the pirate prophet as he wrote volumes upon the ether, with nothing but another man's hand in his. The sea listened, its pen invisible but its memory eternal. The horizon held out her hand to him lovingly and caressed his face. A strand of his hair leapt at his eye, but he did not blink. "Do you not see these men before you?" A murmur from the crew. "Aye, of course, Captain." "As do I. I see them plainly. I see this man, and I see that one, and this one here." He did not point, but rather let his eyes speak for him as they darted from fellow to fellow. "I can trust these men with any one thing or another. They are true cocks of this game. They are men of real sport." Then the lad looked about the crew shyly. "I suppose they know your design." "Yes," said Captain Avery, the bridge man. "They do. And if they were a thing of 10 times the consequence, they should know it." A low, internal groan of approval and pride emanated from the hive that inhabited the deck. "I am a man of fortune, lad, and I must seek my fortune. As I do, so you must do as well, or you will be but a small and forgotten detail of this great and glorious evening." In August 1695, Henry Avery, captaining the 46-gun frigate the Fancy, reached the Mandab Strait, where he teamed up with 5 other pirate ships, including Thomas II's 8-gun, 46-man sloop of war, the Amity. Thomas II would die in the battles to come. Richard Want in the Dolphin, Joseph Farrow in the Portsmouth Adventure, Thomas Wake in the Susanna, and William Mays in the Pearl. Although a Mughal convoy of 25 ships bound for India had eluded the pirate fleet during the night, the following week they would encounter the Ganj-i-Sawai and her escort, the Fateh Muhammad, with both stragglers passing the straits on their way to Surat. Avery and his men attacked the Fateh Muhammad, which had earlier repulsed an attack by the Amity, and this would end up being the battle in which Captain II died. But perhaps intimidated by Fancy's 46 guns, or weakened by their earlier battle with II, the Fateh Muhammad's crew put up very little resistance, and Avery's pirates sacked the ship and came away with 40,000 pounds worth of treasure. Now, the Ganj-i-Sawai, which later came to be called the Gunway by English-speaking people, it was supposed to be the most formidable ship in the seas at this time, and it was known to be carrying over 1,000 people, a lot of rich people, a lot of warriors, soldiers, and sailors and marines from India and other places in the Middle Eastern area. and also a metric shit ton of treasure, okay? So this was going to be the prize to end all prizes. So Avery sailed in pursuit of the Ganj-i-Sawai, overtaking her about 8 days out of Surat. This ship, as we said, was a fearsome opponent. It had somewhere around 62 guns and carried 400 to 500 guards armed with rifles and other small arms, as well as 600 other passengers. But the opening volley almost immediately evened the odds, as one of the Ganj-i-Sawai's magnificent, massive cannons exploded on the deck, killing a ton of the gunners and soldiers in its midst, and it caused great confusion because it started a huge fire on the ship as well. So almost immediately, demoralization of this crew set in, and they couldn't even properly fight Avery's pirates because they had to put this fire out or the ship would burn. So Avery came alongside and fired a broadside, which is when a ship fires every cannon on one side and of the ship. And so in this particular case, that would have been 23 cannons firing simultaneously. And it took down the Ganj-i-Sawai's mainmast, their main mast. And this was a big problem because it meant that this ship was essentially dead in the water now. She couldn't escape. She couldn't really pivot that well. And she was basically a fish in a barrel. So the Fancy drew alongside, and a number of her 113-man crew clambered aboard. They overpowered the hundreds of sailors that were there. And as a matter of fact, the captain of the Ganj-i-Sawai began essentially shoving swords and guns into the slaves' hands, the women slaves, I might add, aboard his ship, and forcing them to fight Avery's crew. And they were throwing boiling water and basically doing everything they could. At the same time, a bunch of these people on board the ship began committing suicide because they feared the pirates, and their reputation somewhat preceded them, rightfully so, because what would follow would be one of the most horrendous acts of cruelty and violence ever committed by pirates. The victorious pirates subjected their captives essentially to several days, some say as much as a week, of murdering the prisoners at will, torturing them, hanging them by their thumbs, all this stuff because this ship had treasure hidden in it somewhere and they didn't know where. And that's kind of a interesting part of the story, is that they couldn't find the treasure on the ship. So deck by deck, they went lower and lower into the belly of the ship. And each time the pirates encountered a new deck, they would find more people having committed suicide or more prisoners to take. Many of these people royalty or from prominent families in India. And they essentially just killed and raped all of these people and forced them to tell them where the treasure was. The loot ended up totaling between, at this point in time, 325,000 and 600,000 pounds, including some 500,000 gold and silver pieces, plus numerous jewels and miscellaneous silver trinkets, and so on and so on and so on. So several of the pirate crews that were accompanying Avery did not really contribute to the fight. They were either in ships that were too slow, and so they didn't get to join in, and they didn't get cut in. And then, of course, Thomas II's ship, his crew was, they were there, but without their captain, they didn't really have much to bargain with, and they didn't do near as much as Avery's crew. And so they didn't get much either. Essentially, long story short, and there's 100 excuses for why Avery didn't give any of these other pirates treasure. Avery basically took all of this, and he was known to be a good captain, so he did end up distributing a lot to his own crew. It was said that each crew member got a little over 1,000 pounds each. because of the victory here. And that was more than most pirate sailors could hope to ever get throughout any career. So this was a pretty big deal. And because of the massive amounts of torture and rape of nobles, India ended up, the Mughal emperor, who's at this time Aurangzeb, sent his army to 5 key ports for English trade in India: in Bombay, in Surat, in Broach, in Agra, and Ahmedabad. And he basically said, I'm closing these ports down, because Avery was an Englishman, and he single-handedly cut off English trade with India as a result of Avery's battle here, his successful taking of the Ganj-i-Sawai, all her treasure, and then his subsequent torture of all of the people and murder of all of the people on board. And he refused to open the ports. He said, Emperor Aurangzeb said he would not open the ports until Henry Avery was caught and executed for his crimes. Now, the East India Company, you might have heard of her, reconciled with the Mughal emperor by fully compensating his losses and filed an insurance claim at this time for £350,000. The Mughal authorities demanded this amount be doubled, though. They were pissed, and they deeply desired to see Avery executed. So this essentially kicked off what is the first global manhunt in history. And it was basically England and Spain and India and all of these different places who came together and said, okay, we're going to hunt Avery down. All of the prominent kingdoms of the time were like, yeah, we're going to hunt this pirate down, and we're going to catch him, and we're going to kill him. Because what he did was an embarrassment to England, because he was an Englishman, and it severed the most prominent trade route of the day between two of the most powerful nations of the day. This was a very wealthy trade route, and if the East India Company is involved, you know there is not only significant money involved, but significant political influence. If this trade route wouldn't have opened back up, essentially the world would not be the way that it is today, and that's basically guaranteed. If this single taking of this ship, the Ganj-i-Sawai, nearly changed the entire world in a geopolitical way for the rest of time. But thanks to good diplomacy, that didn't end up happening. However, only 6 members of Henry Avery's crew were ever captured, and they were indeed tried and executed, but they weren't even found guilty of seizing the Ganj-i-Sawai. They were caught while taking a different ship, and it's debated whether Avery was even their captain at this time, because something strange happened. Henry Avery actually disappeared, okay? He is one of the rare pirates in history to seemingly vanish with his treasure without ever being arrested or killed in battle. And to this day, nobody truly knows where he got off to or how he even got away. But in 2024, there was a very interesting letter that was found in a shipwreck, and by 2 men by the name of Kingsley and Cohen, and they discovered that they're shipwreck hunters, essentially. And again, this is 2024. This is last year. They discovered that the letter linked Avery with one of the first great spy rings that believed, by the way, to have included Daniel Defoe. And if you don't know who that is, he's the guy who wrote Robinson Crusoe. And also Thomas Tennyson was involved, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Some pretty big names here, and I did not know this, but they were all involved in a spy ring for King William III. So together, they were protecting their Protestant England from the threat of popery, essentially, which was a Catholic invasion from France and an enemy that they feared would essentially seize the throne of England. Now, tantalizingly, half of the letter can't be read because it is in some kind of bizarre numeric code. But what is said is that in 1700, pretty much the only people who would be writing in code with notes found on English shipwrecks would be British diplomats and spies. So, Kingsley and Cohen said, "We spent years trying to decipher Avery's secret, and some of the people that they even hired to try to help in this were ex-CIA employees." But the code to this day, of course it's only been a year, but to this day, they have been unable to crack the code. In one passage, Henry Avery allegedly wrote, "I am not the least concerned for Tank 29FB26 being out of the T921159.7, and its meaning remains a secret." Elsewhere in the letter, he referred to meeting his contact that evening and working with no suspicion upon any account. The letter does note that a reply was to be addressed to the post house in Falmouth. Kingsley said that Falmouth in 1700 is where the post office is. That's where the package ships go from. So if you want to be in a place to influence, intercept, or stop threats, that's probably where you'd want to be. Kingsley and Cohen also said that at that same time, Daniel Defoe was in Cornwall, posing as a shipwreck treasure diver himself named Claude Guillot. Defoe worked in intelligence for William III in 1692, and he also invented a numeric code for sending letters. This just makes me want to go read Robinson Crusoe all over again. I read it as a kid, but I had no idea that this dude was so involved. I mean, I think a lot of you guys probably didn't know that, but it's crazy to me when these writers from our childhoods and stuff like that end up being way more than we thought they were. Like, there's rumors of Mark Twain being the same way, and numerous other writers of the day being a little bit more than just storybook writers for some of our favorite childhood tales. But I think it's important to note here something before we get going. It was very important to not let pirates in these days get too far. It was important to kill off piracy and not allow the big pirates who took big prizes, like let's just say Henry Avery or Blackbeard or Calico Jack or any of these other ones, Captain Kidd, all of these pirates that were massive. They couldn't be allowed to succeed too much. And why is that? Because it would mean that the world would see that the elimination of piracy, let me rephrase this. The elimination of piracy would mean the elimination of the free man. That would essentially challenge the world of trade and commerce and law. Pirates could not exist in the way that they seemingly were, because it would influence too greatly the rest of mankind into this idea that they didn't need law, they didn't need order, they didn't need governments, because fate and destiny and a free way of life was still out there. But secrets were hidden under pirate identity. And before I get too far into this, it should be said, so much of pirate history is myth and fable and legend and yarn and shanty and song, because there was not really a paper trail often left by these people. These were outlaws who simply took to the seas a lot of the time and just did whatever they wanted, and they weren't always too concerned with keeping official logs. That was a lot of stuff that was mainly for people who served crowns, sailors who served crowns, captains and admirals who had people to kings and whatnot to report back to. But the pirates kind of just did whatever they want, and a lot of time that meant there wasn't a story left to tell, and all that was left to tell were the tales by sailors who were involved or victims, and a lot of that was just done by word of mouth, similar to how Native American stories have been passed down through the years. It's kind of just stories that are repeated and repeated and embellished and changed and blah, 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 blah. But as I was saying before, secrets were also hidden under the pirate identity. What does that mean? Well, you had letters of marque, which basically a king would give to a pirate that essentially, or anybody, it could be just an ordinary one of their captains or whatever, an admiral, and they would say, you're free to basically take any of our enemy's ships, you're free to take any ship you want and keep the plunder, just eliminate our enemies. And it basically meant that these guys could operate however they wanted to, as long as they were only sinking ships and taking forts and villages and towns and slaves and yada 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 from enemy nations. A lot of times these people were called privateers. They were pirates a lot of the time too that were turned into king's men, and vice versa. Captain Kidd is actually one of those guys who had a letter of marque but seemingly decided he would rather be a pirate, and we will get to him more later because he may have had a very interesting connection to Henry Avery that involved Templar treasure. So this life offered uncontrollable power, plunder, and smuggling of treasure as long as they could stay alive. And it would be easy to transport treasures and secrets pretty much anywhere in the world, it should be said, using pirates and piracy. So what does that mean? Because that statement right there is basically the cornerstone of this episode. If you give a group of vagabonds, of pirates, permission to plunder and steal and destroy and kill anybody as long as they're enemy nations and report to no one, just think of the value that that kind of agent is to a king. Especially when you start thinking about the time that we're in right now. The United States is beginning to blossom. There's still colonies and whatnot, but they're beginning to blossom. And England and a lot of these other nations are beginning to think about going to the New World and establishing colonies and capitals and trading posts and all of this stuff. There's going to need to be a massive amount of wealth transferred between Europe, Africa, the Middle East, etc., to America, right? And that's where stuff really starts to get interesting, because we hear these tales and these yarns of massive treasures being taken, massive treasure ships and fleets going missing, sinking in the ocean or something, just being whisked away. And there are glorious tales of many of those situations occurring because of pirate activity in these days. You hear about some of the largest transfers of wealth occurring with fleets being taken, this transfer of wealth being interrupted by apparently just swashbucklers and criminals with a ship. And a lot of the time, as we just said in the story of Henry Avery, these ships aren't even that fast. And they're outgunned, they're outmanned, they have fewer people. But they do have something that seems to set them apart in some way from the massively more powerful on paper and in the water treasure treasure ships. Because these pirates weren't really interested in just taking any ship, right? They weren't really interested in just burning ships for no reason. They would go after the ones that had treasure. How would they know this unless somebody was feeding them information? And if they had the information, they would know exactly where to attack, and they might even know exactly how to attack. But who would have this type of information among a bunch of drunkards and generally unsavory criminal types? Because back then, education was not what it is today. It was not like these people were more educated. Far from it. A lot of these people could not read, they could not write, they could barely speak. Indeed, a lot of pirates didn't even fight better than the trained sailors and navies that were operating in this day. Because in this day, navies were competing to be the most powerful in the world. You had Spain, you had France, you had England, you had the Indian Navy, which was not very good, I'll admit it, but it was trying to be. Because the nation of India was very wealthy. And so you had all this going on, but still, these massive prizes were taken from these ships. Millions and millions and sometimes billions of dollars worth of gold and silver and jewels in today's currency just being robbed by simple pirates, despite the fact that these navies were highly trained, highly capable, and were used to toppling nations. So why did the pirates have an edge? Well, I'm going to offer you an outlandish idea. There are rumors and tales and rumors of rumors and tales of yarns, of stories, of legends, of myths, that pirates were not exactly what we've been led to believe, you know? And that's why so many of these tales really sound like they're nothing more than storybook myths and legends that you tell little kids to get them excited about adventure and all this kind of stuff. But what if pirates had a bigger role to play here than we're giving them credit for? After all, the Golden Age of Piracy did not last very long. Now, pirates existed outside of the Golden Age of Piracy, of course, but the actual Golden Age of Piracy that we've come to draw most of these pirate heroes from did not last very long at all. It's my opinion, and if you look at stories that involve Oak Island and stuff like that, that these pirates were more than just simple vagabonds. The crews, yeah, they were probably just hired killers most of the time. Hired sailors from other navies and generally from the slums, people who just worked on ships, generally the unsavory, uneducated, violent criminal type. That is, you know, slaves often were forced to fight on pirate ships, all that kind of stuff. But the captains is where it gets really interesting, especially when they start working together, because it seems like there is some kind of strange understanding amongst pirate captains, and there is some kind of strange brotherhood, some kind of strange organization, some kind of strange conglomeration and cooperation. And sometimes these guys even had their own towns. They had their own villages, they had their own ports, they had their forts once in a while, not often very powerful, but they still had them. And some of them would get these letters of marque, but they wouldn't necessarily attack each other and stuff like that. So it's like, even if some of these pirates did indeed work for kings and crowns and governments, they didn't always act against their pirate brothers. And it's my belief, personally, and I've been writing about this and studying this, I'm not even joking, for almost 20 years now, because the piracy, the Golden Age of Piracy, studying it, this is one of my first loves when it comes to history. And the other one is the Crusades. So I began to figure out that there were connections between secret organizations in Europe and pirates. And a lot of treasures and a lot of money just vanished because of pirates. A lot of relics, a lot of things of historical importance fell into the hands of pirates and disappeared completely. And we're led to believe this story about buried treasure, right? Massive amounts of buried gold, pirate gold, buried in the sand or buried in the mountains or buried somewhere. They went up a river and into the hills, and then as their ship ran aground, they took all their chests of gold totaling so many millions of dollars, and they buried it in the sand or under a tree or 15 paces from the rock with the face on it, and blah-de-blah-de-blah. And as much as I want to believe in that, and I do believe in that some of the time, but not all the time, because I think there is a connection to the Templars, to the Freemasons, to the Hospitaller Knights, to the Knights of Malta. All of these organizations seem to have a connection to pirates. Let's go back in time even further. In the book of Judges, in the Bible, we get some strange coordinates, if you will, to the first hint of where pirates maybe came from. It says that Dan, the tribe of Dan, abode in ships. The tribe of Dan occupied the coastal plain of Canaan, and they traded with Phoenician sailors. We were just talking about the Phoenicians. And they had ships and parts of their ships carved into stylized sea serpents and dragons. And to later studiers of this kind of stuff, this image certainly was just metaphorical. You see it with the Vikings and all that kind of stuff. You know, tribal totems as allegory. But to the Danites, it might have been literal. Leviathan was not really considered an enemy, but as a guardian of the deep. So when Israel collapsed, the ports of Dan emptied almost overnight. Classical fragments speak of Danoi or Danuna, which are seafaring mercenaries who appeared suddenly in records around 1200 BC. So whether they were the same people can't necessarily be proven. This is one of those great mysteries of history. This is one of those great things that we've just lost the truth in. But mythographers do continue to see this continuity. A maritime clan who fled persecution, carrying their serpent emblem and the secrets of celestial navigation westward. It appeared they had some kind of power over the sea. And when I say that, I don't mean magically. I just mean they had an understanding. They had a knowledge that at that time was very rare regarding how to move on the sea. Now, that coiled dragon reemerged centuries later on Viking ships and hammered into Norman shields. What a coincidence. And the emblem endured because sailors reused that emblem. Theology changes, but some other things don't. Symbols continue to be constant, they evolve, etc., etc. The serpent, the spiral, the cross of the horizon line, these are also all instruments of both orientation and faith, right? We see them time and time again all over the world across many different cultures. By the 8th century CE, the dragon had become a banner again. The Draki windsock, literally a dragon whose jaws would devour the storm, were on Norse ships and stuff like that. During Charlemagne's campaigns in Hessen, if you guys believe in Charlemagne, I certainly do, the old Chatti tribes fought beneath these banners. Monastic scribes branded them Draconari, servants of the serpent, marking them as descendants of Dan and heretics by blood. So the serpent of the northern tribes became basically the theological enemy, a justification for war, if you will, long before the First Crusade. So when the Franks triumphed, the serpent didn't necessarily die. it went to sea. Defeated warriors fled north or turned to the coast, becoming navigators and raiders, and their lore of stars and winds and hidden currents. If you guys have ever seen the show Vikings, you know, even he had like the moonstone. These all became the skill set of Norse pilots, these Norse shipmen. The dragon standard survived as not only superstition, but kind of a code, a reminder that imperial light could never really tame the northern dark. So we're starting to see how things continue to move through time, much like a ship through the sea. I'm getting really excited. I'm sorry if I'm talking too fast and too loud. Somebody the other day said that I talk way too fast and I need to learn how to take a breath between talking. I do apologize if you're unable to keep up, but this is very exciting stuff. In 1119, a whole new brotherhood arose from that same tension between faith and defiance. And this is where it starts to get real interesting. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. You might know these fellows by a different name, the Knights Templar. Officially, they were warrior monks that were sworn to chastity and poverty. A lot of people think of the Knights Templar as being extremely wealthy knights, but actually they were only kind of wealthy as a group, not as individuals. So a lot of time they were in poverty, they couldn't pay their own ransoms, etc., etc. But they were defenders of pilgrims and fortresses across the Levant, and they were renowned for being great warriors. And in practice, they were bankers and shipwrights, and they were involved in logistics of a global empire. And the papal bulls that created them granted the order the right to trade freely across borders for the maintenance, if you will, of the Holy Land. So they were kind of like pirates with a letter of marque. And that clause gave them their true weapon, maritime sovereignty. People don't realize that the Templars actually had their own navy as well. And there's a lot of speculation about the power of their navy. Some people say that, they were a force to be reckoned with upon the sea, and others say that most of their navy was just rented and they weren't really that good seafaring peoples, but I don't know. Their fleets were painted with a similar symbol as well, the black and white Bosciant, and they operated from Marseille and La Rochelle. Now, below deck, they kept skulls as memento mori, and you can see that on their tombs and on their gravestones. It's a reminder that death was only another form of service. These were real Warhammer 40K style individuals, and some seals show another emblem entirely, a serpent intertwined with the cross. Officially, this represented, of course, Moses' brass serpent when the Israelites were being eaten by snakes and killed off by snakes, right? But unofficially, chroniclers called it the Dragon of Dan. And the very symbol their ancestors had been condemned for worshiping appeared to have returned, sanctified by the Pope. Very interesting stuff. And of course, we're always talking about how the Pope and Catholicism gave rise to a bunch of these mysterious orders. Power without oversight breeds fear, though. And a lot of us know the end of the Templars. It's a strange sort of betrayal. By 1307, King Philip IV of France owed them a fortune that he essentially couldn't repay. So on the night of October 13th, which is why Friday the 13th is considered unlucky to some people, he moved to annihilate the Templars. And arrest warrants reached La Rochelle, which is where most of their ships were, by dawn, and the port was emptied. The Templar fleet had vanished completely. So a lot of the time, we were talking about how a lot of the time it seemed pirates had some kind of information. It appeared that the Templars also had some kind of information that other people just weren't aware of and weren't aware of how they even got it. So the Templar fleet vanished, and witnesses swore up and down that the flagship sailed under a black pennon marked with a white skull, the earliest echo of the pirate ensign. Again, this is legend, this is fable, this is oral history passed down. These are people on the wall who saw this and continued to tell the story, but there were no cameras to take pictures of, and there were no historians to sit here and record this. But that doesn't mean that it's not true. From the moment of that, from that moment, the myths just multiplied and spiraled. And some said the knights had unearthed the treasure of Solomon's temple itself. And there's a whole bunch of rabbit holes you can go down about the Templars somehow coming into contact with Solomon's temple. It involves a lot of mysticism. Some say the Templars didn't even worship Jesus at all. It's actually pretty much proven that they worshipped pagan gods, and that they had some kind of knowledge of mythical things, of magic and of sorcery, and they generally were kind of like pagans that were working for the Catholic Church. Others insisted that they had discovered a Western continent centuries before Columbus and built the stone tower at Newport as proof. Certain occultists called them murdered magicians. They were maybe the original pirate wizards, initiates of forbidden science, capable of undermining the church itself. And maybe that's the real reason they had to be gotten rid of. They had to be exterminated. I'm sure that it's a combination of both their power and influence and their trade networks, as well as what they were owed, and the fact that they were an army, essentially, and a navy. But the boldest version of the story claimed that they established the first pirate brotherhood, and that the Jolly Roger, the pirate flag, the classic skull and crossbones flag, took its name from their Sicilian patron, King Roger II. And that the imagination of this stretched so far that even John Paul Jones, father of the U.S. Navy, was cast as a descendant of these Templar pirates. Is that not crazy, or what? In legend, the Templars were never what they appeared to be. And I think that what the Templars truly were has been hidden from history too. And we talk about this. It has links to Freemasonry and the Illuminati and all that kind of stuff. They were basically the original soldiers of the Illuminati in a lot of ways to a lot of people. And I know there's going to be people who disagree with that. Listen, this whole episode kind of plays out like a pirate legend, because there's no proof of any of this, and there's no proof to the contrary. There's just a bunch of stories and synchronicities that seem to line up. A lot of characters involved in the same things. A lot of pirates getting away with strange stuff who seem to have Templar connections or Templar roots. And a lot of pirates even were Freemasons. That should also be noted. And they fought like warrior knights. They often stood taller than the men around them and were whispered about like they were some heroes or something. In legend, we get a lot of connections between these knights and the Golden Age of Piracy. We have their vows of poverty that masked control of Europe's credit system. Their piety hid experiments in Arabic mathematics and whatnot. They had involvements with alchemical medicine. Some say that they uncovered secrets not of this world, knowledge that drew from ancient Hebrew manuscripts or Arab astronomers that allowed them to see the heavens differently than normal seafaring people, normal navies did. They had basically this understanding of the sky and how to navigate the sea in ways that other navies didn't. Other sailors didn't. And that's why they were so effective at seizing so many prizes that were way more powerful than they were, that were way stronger, that had entire fleets, but it was just them and a couple buddies to take it all down. They were outgunned, outmanned, and yet they were not outmaneuvered ever. And they seemed to be able to move through fleets and move through the water like ghosts. Very interesting stuff when you start to think about and research how the pirates seem to have a different kind of understanding of the sea than the rest of the highly trained navies in the world. So with that knowledge and the audacity that had made them essentially unconquerable in battle, the Templars basically loaded their fleet with relics. And some say that even the Ark of the Covenant was among them. Some say that the cup that Jesus drank out of was among them. And they took all this and they vanished into the Atlantic before France could essentially murder them. And some say that their treasures are buried beneath Manhattan or Oak Island. Oak Island is extremely popular in the History Channel annals and whatnot. Some say that the treasure was hidden in the Alps, owned by some nameless dynasties. But each legend points to the same idea, and that's that they escaped with the blueprint of the modern world. They were still important for some nations. They still had value to people elsewhere in the world, even if they did not have value to the Pope or to France or to England or to whoever they were serving at that time, because a lot of the time these guys they basically went where the church told them to go a lot of the time. And the church, the Pope might be of a different nationality, he might have different alliances, etc. So official record, as we've come to believe and as we've come to see, only records the purge of the Templars, and it seemed like it happened pretty dang quick. And we've gone over some different ideas even on this show about what might have happened to them, and if they weren't actually killed off, what did happen. Certainly some of them got away. There were already rumors when some of the Templars who weren't lucky enough to make it out, some of the ones that did get murdered, there were already rumors that the Templar fleet had been warned and sailed from La Rochelle before the arrests even took place, but allegedly nobody really knew the destination. It is interesting, though, that 2 knights were said to have appeared beside Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn that same year, carrying the Red Cross of the Temple. And this is in Scottish legend, but what a coincidence. From there, the map kind of dissolves. You know, you got these stories of voyages across the Atlantic, of hidden colonies, returns to the Middle East and whatnot. And a lot of these stories have been erased and rubbed from the record, and they are discredited and whatnot. But as all good mysteries do, the trail ends at the edge of the known world, and you gotta dig deeper. I think that maybe the fugitive ships just scattered all over the place. Some headed north to Scotland, others went to Portugal. In 1319, King Denis recharted the remnants as the Order of Christ. That's what the Templars essentially became, the Order of Christ. And any Templar treasure that was seized, or Templar property and personnel, then became the Order of Christ. And it's not bureaucratic mercy necessarily, but more of like a strategic continuity. It's kind of like how CIA missions and projects change name, but the project still continues. And in the same case, the Templars had the same fleet. They had the same officers, but a completely different flag. It's kind of like that. And by the 15th century, the Templar Order's Red Cross adorned the sails of Prince Henry the Navigator's caravels. So, what we see is that even though many of the Templars escaped with their ships and went to places unknown, the ones that stayed alive somehow were changed into a completely different identity. The Templar Sea Empire had survived in all but title. Their name changed, but a lot of them were still there in service to crowns. So, I know what you're thinking now. Well, what happened to the La Rochelle fleet? The ones that escaped, the ones that were allegedly warned, where did those guys end up? Well, the night before Philip's arrests of the Templars, port records do actually note missing ships, crews that were unpaid, berths that were suddenly vacant. Chroniclers in Poitou later claimed that a portion of the fleet put to sea before dawn, but there wasn't anybody to write it down or anything like that. It was a rumor that the galleons rode the westerlies and vanished beyond the horizon. On those same currents, a modern sailor from today could reach the Caribbean in 40 days. That is crazy. So from that seed grew the Jolly Rouge, the Pretty Red, which is a name French sailors gave to the black flags that were later flown by Caribbean buccaneers. And in that retelling, the black and white Boisillante became the Jolly Roger. Like we already said, the skull and bones that once marked Templar tombs now marked pirate ships. So what had been memento mori transformed into open defiance of death itself. And centuries later, when Sir Henry Morgan hoisted that flag above Port Royal in Jamaica, because he was a governor there, also interesting, witnesses whispered that the missing Templar fleet had finally resurfaced. Morgan, the Welsh privateer who served a crown, betrayed it and literally ruled a pirate republic. Entire books have been written about this. He's one of the most famous pirates of all time. And that embodied the Temple's paradox, knight and heretic, servant and sovereign. He signed orders with crosses rather than names. He convened councils like monastic chapters, and he buried his dead with bones arranged in ancient patterns. To the empire, he was a criminal. But to this weird pirate brotherhood of the sea that had come to be, he was a sort of grand master returned from exile. Obviously elaborate words, but I'm trying to show a correlation here. So whether this is fact or folklore, the rumor bridges centuries between Crusader and Corsair, the same creed of mastery and rebellion traveling west with the trade winds. The black sails of Morgan and his pirate brethren were not an ending, but rather, again, another inheritance of Templar influence. The temple, essentially unbound. But the story doesn't end with the Templar fleet that vanished from La Rochelle. When papal warrants shattered the temple in 1307, its sister order, the Hospitallers of St. John, adapted because they kind of saw the writing on the wall. And these guys were bad mofos as well. And they were driven first from the Holy Land to Rhodes and then to Malta, where they refashioned their vows into naval doctrine. And many people argue that it's not necessarily the Templars that became pirates, but if anybody did, it was most likely to be these Hospitallers, who later became like the Knights of Malta. Their black ships bore red crosses as well in place of relics, and their cannons were sometimes even made from smelted down church bells. These guys weren't monks anymore. They were admirals, they were captains, and they did prey upon other smaller nations and other pirates. These guys knew what was up when it came to the sea. So when the Ottoman corsairs came, they met them with equal ferocity and basically transformed religious warfare into a private maritime economy. And that whole story is insane as well. The confrontation essentially reached its zenith in 1565 at the Great Siege of Malta, where 6,000 defenders held against 30,000 Turks, and the battle raged for almost 4 months. There were so many shipwrecks and bodies in the sea that some people say they could walk on the water because of it. And when the smoke cleared, the Hospitallers still held Malta. They had prevailed, and Europe hailed them as the last true crusaders. But that victory was also a curse because it marked the end of faith-driven war and the beginning of essentially mercenary Christianity. So from that moment, Europe's holy navies became what? Privateers. Letters of marque came into existence. Papally sanctioned pirates under new titles. The line between crusader and corsair dissolved. They were pirates, people. Among the earliest of these Templars and knights to turn into this kind of new identity was Roger de Flor, and he was a Templar sergeant that turned into basically an adventurer because his fortune collapsed in 1291, so accused of theft and profiteering, he was expelled from the Templar order. And so he became something altogether new, which was a mercenary admiral with some type of allegiance. He became allied to the Byzantine emperor, and he founded the Catalan Company. And this was a drifting army of ex-Templars, and they fought Turks. But they also raided Christians. So to Western chroniclers, Roger de Flor became the apostate Templar, essentially. He was a proverbial sea wolf who replaced the rule of St. Bernard with the laws of naval warfare. And to others, he was kind of also a prototype of a new individual, a new sect of people, knights who were stripped of their land and their money and compelled to earn salvation through navigation and war on the sea. And this Catalan company carried not just swords, but also knowledge. Knowledge of fortification, logistics, coded signals, all things that he learned from the Templars' fleet. These exploits along the Aegean coast proved that the transition from monk to corsair really only required one thing, and that's being exiled by the church and deciding not to take it. So in his shadow, the medieval world began to really dissolve, and a new order of seaborne brotherhoods took its place. Whatever their ancestry, these corsair fraternities shared one unmistakable trait that we've mentioned multiple times now over the course of this last hour, and that is intelligence. They knew everything. They knew routes, they knew tides, they knew convoy schedules, they knew the powers of fortresses and whatnot. Ottoman governors complained that these Maltese pirates knew the sailing of every single ship from Alexandria. They seemed unable to be stopped because they inherited a culture that prized secrecy and observation. They were literally knights of orders, the same habits that once made the Templars indispensable to kings. And so 2 centuries later, the Caribbean buccaneers would exhibit that same sixth sense. They intercepted treasure fleets far from known routes. They struck at moments when imperial defenses were the weakest. They knew when certain slower ships were going to break off from fleets and become easy prizes. Such precision implied way more than luck. It meant that there were networks of information and intelligence at work here, a continuous line of maritime espionage stretching from Rhodes to Port Royal. A secret brotherhood of pilots and informants who sold knowledge as their most precious cargo. But they also buried each other's treasure, transported each other's treasures, and when these kings of the days began to realize we need these people on our team because they are far more knowledgeable of the sea than we are, they hired them. And that is when they began shuttling treasure and valuables and knowledge from place to place under the secret order of kings. But at heart, they were still pirates. Captain Samuel Bellamy's capture of the Whydah, which is widely regarded as one of the most valuable prizes ever taken on the sea in 1717, depended on insider charts. Proof of cooperation within the slave trade bureaucracy. Henry Avery, who we started this episode with, his ambush of the convoy in 1695 required data available only to East India Company officers. Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, blockaded Charleston, not for medicine, but for something else that nobody's really sure what, but perhaps a contract executed through shadow investors. Jean Lafitte, he basically is the only reason that America is still a nation. Because of his pirates, he was able to hold off the coast for North America, for the USA, for the colonies. Each of these operations bore the signature of intelligence work, not just rogues and opportunism. So if these ancient cultures, the Templar and the Hospitaller traditions, if they survived anywhere, this is where it was. In the discipline of command, the flow of gold through invisible financiers, the balance between faith and anarchy, the creation of new nations, the transfer of power and wealth and knowledge from fraternity to fraternity across the sea. And yeah, they absolutely stole it from each other as well. That's why some of these pirates were able to actually take some of this stuff, is because they went rogue. Of course that happened from time to time. But the black flag was not just a mark of chaos. It was also a signal of continuity, that the latest uniform of an ancient profession just changed colors. Soldiers of fortune bound by secrets. So by 1723, when the British Navy retook Nassau and hanged the last of these pirate brethren, it would seem there were individuals who made it out, like Henry Avery, who later began to work for the crown again as a spy, right? But once again, it would appear that the sea belonged to empires and crowns and large navies. But I think that a lot of these secrets just went inland. The Maritime Brotherhood reemerged as merchants and lodges, and later as the Order of Navigation that trained the next generation of explorers. So when legend claims that the Templar fleet of La Rochelle reappeared centuries later under the black sails of Henry Morgan, perhaps it's not just referring to genealogy, but to a continuity of function. The archetype, the warrior monk turned seaborne freelancer. It resurfaces wherever power leaves a vacuum. The Hospitallers became admirals. The Templars became ghosts, pirates. The pirates became myths. Together, they map the evolution of a single idea, that a man with a ship and a secret oath can live outside the reach of kings. By the 18th century, fragments of that brotherhood had washed up on American shores as well. Colonial archives from Louisiana and the Gulf Coast talk of men from the sea using peculiar emblems. A serpent coiled around a compass rose. The correspondence of Jean Lafitte, the French corsair who alternated between piracy and espionage, refers to the Brethren in the Delta and the Black Cross of the Old Order. In one of his last letters, he wrote that he would seek the Black Cross again beyond the Isles, and then he vanished at sea. When Freemasonry spread to New Orleans, a decade later, several lodges adopted nautical symbolism nearly identical to his seal. Anchors entwined with serpents, compasses crossed by skulls. Whether imitation or inheritance, the design yet again reveals this kind of continuity, the secret architecture of the dragon line embedded within colonial brotherhoods. And then we have the group the Skull and Bones, this sort of secret organization of super wealthy people. I think George Bush was in it, among some other people, right? One more of these groups with a nod to the Skull and Crossbones, the Jolly Roger, the Memento Mori, the Templars. Even though none of this can be properly proven, because it's just one of those mysteries of our world, one of those unknowns that we will never get to the bottom of, because there's no recorded history of it, and that is by design. I think that's by design. You've got to admit that there are these threads that seem to course through history, from the tribe of Dan to the Templars to the pirates to George W. Bush. And a lot of the time, it's just simply undeniable. We will never know what we don't know. if there's nobody to tell us that it happened. Mark Twain once said, "Now and then we had a hope that if we lived and were good, God would permit us to be pirates." The life is in the blood.